The dust devils danced across the parched earth of the Wyoming Territory in the summer of 1887, swirling around the weathered boots of Thomas McKinnon as he stood on the porch of his ranch house, reading the same letter for the dozenth time. The paper, creased and worn from handling, contained the reply he'd been waiting for, an acceptance from one Miss Catherine Bell of St. Louis, Missouri, who had agreed to become his mail-order bride. Thomas had built his ranch, the Circle M, from nothing but determination and backbreaking labor. At 35, he possessed the kind of lean strength that came from wrestling cattle and fighting the unforgiving frontier elements. His hands, scarred from barbed wire and rope burns, had never known the gentle touch of a woman, save for the occasional visit to the saloon girls in town, encounters that left him feeling more empty than fulfilled. The loneliness of the frontier had driven him to place an advertisement in the eastern newspapers, seeking a respectable woman to share his life and help him build something lasting. He had specified his requirements clearly: a woman of good moral character, preferably with some education, who could manage a household and perhaps bear him children to carry on the McKinnon name. What he hadn't expected was for fate to intervene in the most unexpected way possible. The stagecoach arrived 3 days late, covered in dust and bearing the scars of what appeared to have been a harrowing journey. Thomas had dressed in his best shirt and cleaned his boots, determined to make a proper first impression on his intended bride. As the coach door swung open, he stepped forward with his hat in his hands, ready to greet the prim and proper Miss Catherine Bell. Instead, a woman emerged who took his breath away for entirely different reasons. She was beautiful, certainly, but not in the demure way he had expected. Her auburn hair caught the afternoon sun like burnished copper, and her green eyes held a directness that seemed to pierce right through a man's pretenses. She wore a traveling dress of deep blue silk that, while modest by Eastern standards, seemed almost scandalously form-fitting by frontier measures. There was something about her bearing, confident, unashamed, almost defiant, that immediately set her apart from any woman Thomas had ever encountered. "Mr. McKinnon," she asked, her voice carrying the faint traces of an Irish accent. "I'm Catherine O'Malley. I believe you've been expecting me." The surname was Rowan, but Thomas attributed that to some clerical error or perhaps a previous marriage she hadn't mentioned. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, replacing his hat and extending his hand to help her down from the coach. "Welcome to Wyoming Territory. I hope your journey wasn't too difficult." Catherine accepted his assistance with a grace that seemed both natural and practiced. "Difficult enough," she said, brushing dust from her skirts. "Though I suspect the journey is just beginning." As the coach driver unloaded her belongings, 2 well-made leather trunks and a carpet bag, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite as he'd expected. There was an air about Catherine that suggested she'd seen more of the world than most respectable ladies, and the way the other passengers on the coach had pointedly avoided her gaze during the unloading process struck him as odd. "I've prepared a room for you in the main house," Thomas said, leading her toward the ranch. "Mrs. Henderson from the neighboring spread has agreed to act as chaperone until we can arrange for a proper wedding. I thought perhaps we might get to know each other a bit before, Mr. McKinnon," Catherine interrupted, placing a gloved hand on his arm. "There's something I need to tell you. Something that changes everything." The late afternoon sun painted the ranch buildings in shades of gold and amber as Catherine explained the circumstances that had brought her to his doorstep. The real Catherine Bell, she revealed, had been robbed and murdered while traveling west. Catherine O'Malley had been on the same stage, fleeing St. Louis under circumstances she was not yet ready to discuss, when the attack occurred. Finding herself stranded and possessing the murdered woman's papers, she had made a desperate decision to assume her identity. "So you see," she concluded, her chin raised defiantly despite the vulnerability in her eyes, "I'm not the respectable bride you ordered. I'm an imposter, and if you want me gone, I'll understand." Thomas studied her face in the fading light, noting the way she held herself ready for rejection, as if she'd been expecting it her entire life. Any reasonable man would send her away immediately. Any prudent rancher would put her back on the next stage to wherever she'd come from. But Thomas McKinnon had built his life on taking calculated risks, and something about Catherine O'Malley, her honesty in confessing her deception, her obvious intelligence, the hint of steel beneath her feminine exterior, intrigued him in ways he couldn't fully explain. "What were you running from in St. Louis?" he asked. Catherine's laugh held no humor. "The same thing most women run from, Mr. McKinnon. a life that had become impossible to continue. Over the following days, the truth emerged in fragments. Catherine had not been a seamstress or a teacher, as the murdered Miss Bell claimed to be. She had been one of the most sought-after courtesans in St. Louis, known throughout the river towns for her beauty, wit, and the exclusive clientele she entertained. But the life that had once seemed glamorous had gradually become a gilded cage, and, when her final patron had made demands that even her hardened sensibilities couldn't accept, she had fled with whatever money she could gather. The revelation should have ended things immediately. Any respectable rancher would have been horrified to discover he'd welcomed a fallen woman into his home. But Thomas found himself looking past the scandal to the woman herself, intelligent, resourceful, and carrying herself with a dignity that her former profession couldn't diminish. Mrs. Henderson, the neighboring woman who had agreed to serve as chaperone, was less understanding. Upon learning the truth about Catherine's past, she departed immediately, leaving behind a flurry of whispered warnings about the corruption of decent society and the wages of sin. Alone with Catherine for the first time since her arrival, Thomas found himself at a crossroads. The proper thing would be to arrange passage for her to continue west, perhaps to California, where a woman could reinvent herself more easily. The practical thing would be to cut his losses and place another advertisement for a mail-order bride. Instead, he found himself drawn into conversations that stretched long into the evening hours, discovering layers of complexity in Catherine that challenged every assumption he'd held about women of her former profession. "Do you think less of me now that you know?" Catherine asked one evening as they sat on the ranch house porch, watching the stars emerge in the vast Wyoming sky. Thomas considered his answer carefully. "I think you've made choices that I might not have made," he said finally. "But I also think you've survived circumstances that might have destroyed someone else entirely. That takes a kind of strength I can respect." Catherine turned to study his profile in the moonlight. "Most men want to possess me or punish me. I'm not sure which category you fall into." "Maybe I'm hoping to understand you," Thomas replied. "And maybe I'm hoping you might want to understand me in return." The ranch work continued around them as the days passed. Catherine proved surprisingly adaptable to frontier life, learning to manage the household accounts with a mathematical precision that impressed Thomas, and showing an intuitive understanding of the social dynamics among the ranch hands that helped her navigate the complex territory between being respected and being accepted. Not everyone was welcoming. When word of Catherine's past inevitably spread to the neighboring ranches and the nearby town of Cedar Falls, the reactions ranged from scandalous curiosity to outright hostility. The local preacher, Reverend Samuel Hartwell, made a point of calling on Thomas to express his concerns about the influence such a woman might have on the moral fabric of the community. "Mr. McKinnon," the preacher said, settling his considerable bulk into one of the chairs on the front porch, "I feel it's my Christian duty to express the concern that many in our community share regarding your houseguest." Thomas set down the bridle he'd been mending and fixed the preacher with a steady gaze. "Catherine is under my protection, Reverend. I'd appreciate it if you'd speak of her with respect." "Protection?" Reverend Hartwell's eyebrows climbed toward his receding hairline. "Sir, this woman is a known harlot. Her very presence here is a scandal that reflects poorly on all decent folk." "What I know," Thomas said, his voice carrying a warning edge, "is that Catherine O'Malley has worked harder in the past month than some folks do in a year. She's proven herself capable, intelligent, and honest about her circumstances. If that's not enough for your idea of Christian charity, Reverend, then perhaps your Christianity needs examining." The preacher departed in a huff, but his visit was only the beginning of the social pressure that would be brought to bear on Thomas's decision to allow Catherine to remain at the Circle M. The town's respectable women made pointed comments about the company Thomas was keeping, and several of the larger ranchers began expressing doubts about doing business with a man who would consort with such a woman. Through it all, Catherine maintained a dignity that impressed even her harshest critics. She attended church services despite the cold stares and whispered comments, holding her head high and responding to hostility with a grace that gradually began to win over some of the more open-minded members of the community. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. The woman who had arrived as a desperate fugitive was slowly becoming someone else entirely, not through denying her past, but by building something new upon its foundation. She threw herself into ranch life with an enthusiasm that surprised everyone, including herself. She learned to preserve meat for the winter months, to treat sick cattle with home remedies that proved remarkably effective, and to manage the complex logistics of running a large operation with the organizational skills she'd developed in her previous life. Thomas watched this transformation with growing admiration and something deeper that he was hesitant to name. Catherine's past had taught her to read people with uncanny accuracy, and she applied this skill to everything from negotiating with suppliers to managing the ranch hands with a combination of firmness and fairness that earned their grudging respect. The real test came during the autumn roundup, when a massive storm threatened to scatter the cattle and destroy months of work. While most of the neighboring ranchers' wives remained safely indoors, Catherine insisted on joining the effort to bring the herd to safety. She rode through the driving rain and fierce winds with a determination that impressed even the most skeptical of the cowboys, helping to save not only the Circle M's cattle but assisting with the herds of neighboring ranches as well. It was during that storm that Thomas finally understood what had been growing between them. As he watched Catherine risk her own safety to help save a neighbor's horse that had become trapped in a flash flood, he realized that somewhere along the way, he had fallen in love not with the idea of what she might become, but with who she actually was, past and all. The moment of truth came on a clear November evening when Catherine approached him with a letter she'd been writing. "I've been corresponding with a woman in San Francisco," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "She runs a boarding house for women who are trying to start over. She's agreed to give me work and a place to stay." Thomas felt his heart constrict. "You want to leave?" Catherine's composure cracked slightly. "I want to stop being the source of trouble in your life, Thomas. You've been kinder to me than I had any right to expect, but I can see what my presence here is costing you. The other ranchers are starting to exclude you from business deals. The town folks whisper whenever you show your face in Cedar Falls. You deserve better than the scandal I bring with me. What if I think I deserve exactly what I've got?" Thomas asked, stepping closer to her. "What if I think what we've built here together is worth more than the good opinion of people who've never faced the kind of choices you've had to make?" Tears began to spill down Catherine's cheeks despite her efforts to maintain control. "Thomas, you don't understand what I've been. The things I've done." "I understand that you've survived," Thomas interrupted, reaching out to cup her face in his hands. "I understand that you've taken the worst circumstances life could throw at you and found a way to not just endure them, but to come out stronger. I understand that watching you rebuild yourself has made me want to be a better man than I was before you came here." The kiss that followed was tender and desperate at the same time, carrying with it months of unspoken longing and the weight of two hearts that had found in each other something worth fighting for. The wedding took place 3 weeks later in the parlor of the Circle M ranch house, with only a handful of witnesses present. Judge William Harrison, a pragmatic man who'd seen enough of life to value substance over reputation, performed the ceremony. The few neighbors who attended did so out of genuine friendship rather than social obligation, understanding that they were witnessing something rare: two people who had chosen love over convention, truth over appearance. Catherine wore a simple dress of ivory silk that she'd sewn herself, and Thomas had traded cattle to obtain a gold ring that gleamed on her finger as she spoke the vows that would transform her from Catherine O'Malley, the notorious courtesan, into Catherine McKinnon, frontier wife. The transformation, however, was far from complete. The real work began in the months that followed, as they navigated the complex territory of building a life together while confronting the ongoing challenges posed by Catherine's past. There were setbacks and difficulties. Some business relationships that Thomas had cultivated for years came to an end when their associates refused to deal with a man married to a former prostitute. The local banker, pressured by his wife and other prominent ladies in town, called in a loan earlier than agreed upon, creating financial stress that forced them to sell off part of their cattle herd. More challenging than the external pressures were the internal struggles that Catherine faced as she worked to forge a new identity. Years of viewing herself as a commodity to be purchased had left deep scars on her sense of self-worth. There were nights when she would wake from nightmares about her past, and mornings when she questioned whether she deserved the happiness she'd found. Thomas proved to be patient and understanding in ways that continually surprised her. Rather than demanding that she simply forget her past, he encouraged her to see it as part of what had made her the strong, resourceful woman he'd fallen in love with. When she struggled with feelings of unworthiness, he reminded her of the tangible ways she'd improved not just his life, but the lives of everyone on the ranch. The winter of their first year of marriage was particularly challenging. Snow fell early and heavily that year, isolating the ranch for weeks at a time. The enforced intimacy of being snowbound together allowed them to deepen their relationship, but it also brought tensions to the surface. Catherine, accustomed to the sophisticated entertainment and constant stimulation of city life, sometimes felt overwhelmed by the silence and isolation of the frontier. Thomas, used to the solitary rhythms of bachelor life, had to adjust to sharing his space and his decisions with another person. It was during one of the worst blizzards of that winter that Catherine proved herself in a way that changed everything. When Thomas developed pneumonia after being caught in a storm while checking on the cattle, Catherine nursed him back to health with a combination of medical knowledge gained during her years in the city and an intuitive understanding of what he needed. For 3 days and nights, she barely left his bedside, applying warm compresses, monitoring his fever, and somehow knowing exactly when to push him to fight and when to let him rest. As he recovered, Thomas realized that Catherine had moved beyond merely adapting to ranch life; she had claimed it as her own. The woman who had once relied on her beauty and sexuality for survival had discovered depths of strength and capability that she'd never known she possessed. Spring brought new challenges and new opportunities. Word had spread throughout the territory about the unusual marriage at the Circle M, and reactions varied widely. Some viewed it as a romantic story of redemption and true love conquering social convention. Others saw it as a dangerous precedent that threatened the moral order they were trying to establish in the frontier communities. The test of their commitment came when Catherine's past literally rode up to their front door in the form of Marcus Whitmore, a wealthy St. Louis businessman who had been one of her most persistent admirers. Whitmore had tracked her across half the continent, driven by an obsession that had only intensified since her disappearance. "Catherine, my dear," Whitmore said as he dismounted from his expensive horse, his Eastern clothing and soft features marking him as an outsider in the harsh frontier environment. "You've led me quite a chase. I've come to take you home where you belong." Catherine, who had been hanging laundry when he arrived, straightened slowly, every line of her body radiating tension. "I am home, Marcus. And I belong exactly where I am." Whitmore's smile was condescending as he looked around at the simple ranch buildings and the vast, empty landscape. "Come now, Catherine. Surely you don't prefer this primitive existence to the life of luxury I can provide. I'm prepared to overlook your little adventure and welcome you back with open arms." "The lady has made her position clear," Thomas said, appearing around the corner of the barn with a rifle cradled casually in his arms. "I'd suggest you respect it." Whitmore's expression hardened as he took in Thomas's work-worn appearance and direct manner. "I don't believe we've been introduced. I'm Marcus Whitmore, and Catherine and I have a long-standing arrangement." Catherine corrected firmly. "Whatever we had ended when I left St. Louis, Marcus. I'm married now, and I'm not interested in revisiting the past." The confrontation that followed revealed the depths of Whitmore's obsession and the extent to which Catherine had changed. The man who had once wielded considerable power over her through his wealth and social position found himself facing a woman who was no longer vulnerable to his particular form of manipulation. Catherine's newfound strength, built through months of honest work and genuine love, proved to be more powerful than any hold her former life might have maintained over her. Whitmore left eventually, but not before making threats about exposing Catherine's past to influential people throughout the territory. The confrontation served as a watershed moment in Catherine's journey toward complete transformation. She realized that she was no longer running from her past; she was actively choosing her future. The summer of their second year brought a drought that tested every rancher in the territory. Water became precious, and the complex relationships between neighbors were strained as everyone fought to save their cattle and their livelihoods. It was during this crisis that Catherine's unique background proved unexpectedly valuable. Her years of managing complex social situations in St. Louis had given her diplomatic skills that proved crucial in negotiating water rights and sharing agreements between the various ranchers. She had learned to read people's motivations and find common ground even in the most contentious situations. What had once been the manipulative skills of a courtesan were transformed into the leadership abilities of a frontier woman who could bring disparate groups together for their mutual benefit. By autumn of that year, Catherine had become something unprecedented in the territory, a former prostitute who had not only achieved respectability but had become a leader in her community. The women who had once shunned her began seeking her advice on everything from household management to dealing with difficult husbands. The men who had initially viewed her with a mixture of lust and disdain came to respect her intelligence and judgment. The final validation of Catherine's transformation came when she was asked to help organize the territory's first formal school. The community had grown large enough to support proper education for the children, but organizing such an undertaking required someone with the skills to coordinate multiple families, manage resources, and navigate the inevitable personality conflicts. Catherine threw herself into the project with enthusiasm, drawing on every skill she'd developed throughout her life. Her mathematical abilities, honed during her years of managing her earnings in St. Louis, helped her create budgets and track expenses. Her understanding of human nature allowed her to mediate disputes between parents with different ideas about curriculum and discipline. Her experience with logistics helped her organize everything from finding suitable space to arranging for supplies to be shipped from back east. The day the Cedar Falls School opened its doors, with Catherine serving as its first school board president, marked the complete transformation of her social status. The woman who had arrived as a desperate fugitive had become one of the most respected members of the community. But, perhaps the most profound change was internal. Catherine had moved beyond simply escaping her past, she had integrated it into a new identity that drew strength from every experience she'd survived. She no longer saw her years in St. Louis as a source of shame to be hidden, but as part of the complex journey that had brought her to where she was meant to be. The philosophical underpinning of Catherine's transformation, that a person who destroys their weak self can never be destroyed by others, became evident in the way she approached every challenge. She had learned to see adversity not as something to be feared, but as an opportunity to discover new depths of strength and resilience. Thomas, too, had been transformed by their relationship. The solitary rancher who had once measured his worth by the size of his herd and the profitability of his operation had learned to value the intangible qualities that made life worth living. He had discovered that real strength came not from individual accomplishment, but from the bonds formed with another person who chose to face life's challenges alongside him. Their marriage became a model for others in the territory who were struggling to build meaningful relationships in the harsh frontier environment. They had proven that love could transcend social conventions and that two people committed to each other's growth could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. As the years passed, Thomas and Catherine McKinnon became legendary figures in the development of Wyoming Territory. Their ranch prospered, not just because of Thomas's skill with cattle or Catherine's organizational abilities, but because they had created something larger than themselves, a partnership based on mutual respect, genuine affection, and an unwavering commitment to building something lasting together. Catherine never completely escaped the whispers about her past, but she had moved beyond caring about the opinions of those who chose to judge her by her history rather than her actions. She had learned that true respectability came not from conforming to social expectations, but from living with integrity and treating others with dignity. The story of their unlikely courtship and marriage spread throughout the frontier, becoming the stuff of legend. In saloons and parlors, around campfires and at church socials, people told and retold the tale of the rancher who had called for a mail-order bride and received instead a famous prostitute who became the love of his life. But those who knew them personally understood that the real story was more complex and more inspiring than any legend could capture. It was a story about the power of second chances, the possibility of redemption, and the transformative force of love that sees past surface appearances to the deeper truth of human worth. Thomas and Catherine McKinnon had proven that the most powerful force in human experience is not the weight of the past, but the courage to choose who you want to become. They had shown that a person willing to confront their weaknesses and transform them into strengths becomes literally invulnerable to the judgment and manipulation of others. In destroying her weak self, the frightened, dependent woman who had sold herself for security, Catherine had created something infinitely stronger, a woman who knew her own worth and would never again allow it to be determined by external circumstances. Thomas, in choosing love over convention and substance over appearance, had destroyed his own weak self, the lonely, isolated man who measured his worth by others' approval. Together, they had built something that could weather any storm, a relationship based not on need or convenience, but on the deliberate choice to see the best in each other and to support each other's continued growth. They had proven that when two people commit to helping each other become their strongest selves, they create a bond that cannot be broken by external pressures or internal doubts. The ranch house where their unlikely love story had unfolded stood as a testament to the power of transformation. What had begun as a simple business arrangement, a mail-order marriage between strangers, had evolved into something far more significant, a partnership that honored both participants' complete humanity, including the parts of their histories that others might find shameful or unacceptable. Years later, when visitors to the Circle M asked about the secret of their obviously happy marriage, Catherine would smile and offer a simple explanation: "Thomas never asked me to be anyone other than who I was. And I decided to become the best version of that person." Thomas would add his own perspective: "Catherine taught me that love isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about finding someone perfect for you, and then choosing every day to see them clearly and love them completely." Their story became a cornerstone legend of the American frontier, but its deeper significance lay in its demonstration that human transformation is always possible for those brave enough to undertake it. Catherine O'Malley McKinnon had proven that a person's past need not determine their future, and that the greatest victories are won not through conquering others, but through conquering the limitations we place on ourselves. The woman who had once sold her body to survive had learned to give her heart freely. The man who had once lived in isolation had learned to build a life in partnership with another. Together, they had created something that transcended their individual limitations and became a testament to the infinite possibility contained within the human spirit when it commits to growth, transformation, and love. In the end, their story was not really about the frontier or the Wild West or the social conventions of their era. It was about the eternal human capacity to transcend circumstances, to choose growth over stagnation, and to find in the love of another person the courage to become the fullest expression of who we are meant to be. The rancher had indeed called for marriage, and fate had sent him exactly what he needed: not the respectable bride he thought he wanted, but the extraordinary woman who would teach him that respectability earned through courage and integrity is infinitely more valuable than respectability inherited through circumstance. Catherine had discovered that being chosen for who she truly was, rather than being purchased for what she could provide, was the foundation of genuine love and lasting happiness. Their legacy lived on in the community they had helped to build, in the school Catherine had organized, in the ranch that continued to thrive, and, most importantly, in the example they had set of two people who refused to be defined by others' expectations and, instead, chose to define themselves through their actions, their love, and their unwavering commitment to each other's highest good. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. This truth had been proven not through philosophy or theory, but through the lived experience of two people who had dared to love completely and had discovered that such love makes any person invulnerable to the worst that life can offer, because they had already chosen to face it together.